I worked late every night for months to secure a promotion, only to watch my colleague take credit for my presentation in front of the boss. I left my office without saying a word, and the next day, everyone discovered the proof I shared online. I had poured months of my life into that project. From the very first brainstorming session, I had been consumed with every detail: the research, the slides, the meticulous notes, and the endless data analysis. It wasn't just about doing my job, it was about proving to myself and to my boss that I was capable of more than what my title suggested. The late nights blurred into early mornings, and weekends became an extension of my weekdays. My apartment was littered with sticky notes, spreadsheets, and coffee cups, and the living room floor became my temporary office, papers scattered like confetti from a celebration I was still awaiting. Every hour I spent reviewing statistics, refining graphs, and rehearsing the flow of the presentation was a step toward a promotion I had long desired. I imagined the moment I would stand in front of the board, the boss nodding in approval, my team acknowledging my leadership. The mental replay of that triumph kept me going, even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. I reminded myself that this was more than a project. It was my opportunity to finally claim the recognition I had earned through years of quiet diligence and uncelebrated effort. The day of the presentation arrived with all the tension of a high-stakes performance. I had stayed late the night before, ensuring every slide was flawless, every talking point rehearsed, and every answer anticipated. I arrived at the office early, coffee in hand, mentally running through my speech. But as I stepped into the conference room, a scene unfolded that I could hardly believe. My colleague, someone I had shared casual office camaraderie with but never truly trusted, stood at the front, confidently speaking about the project as though it were entirely their creation. The graphs I had painstakingly designed, the data I had meticulously analyzed, the innovative strategies I had developed, they were all being presented as his work. He smiled, laughed at his own jokes, and received nods of approval from our boss. My heart sank, a cold weight settling in my chest. Every late night, every sacrifice, every ounce of effort I had invested seemed to vanish in that single moment. I felt a rush of disbelief, anger, and helplessness. Words caught in my throat as my colleague continued speaking, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the injustice unfolding before everyone's eyes. I sat frozen at my desk, watching the scene play out as if it were happening to someone else. The boss praised his initiative, complimented his unique insights, and nodded approvingly at every point he made, completely oblivious to the fact that the work, the brilliance, and the hours behind it all were mine. My mind raced through possible interventions, each scenario ending in either humiliation, confrontation, or escalation I wasn't ready to handle. I realized that saying something in the moment could lead to a scene I couldn't control. Perhaps my voice would be dismissed, perhaps it would be blamed on jealousy, perhaps I would be seen as unprofessional. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I quietly gathered my things, left my office without saying a word, and walked out of the building. The air outside felt sharper than usual, the city noises strangely distant, as I moved through the streets, trying to process the blend of fury, betrayal, and grief inside me. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text. I didn't try to explain. I simply walked, the weight of unacknowledged effort pressing on me like a leaden cloak. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying the day over and over in my mind. I imagined countless ways the presentation could have been exposed, countless confrontations that could have asserted my ownership. But the more I thought, the more I realized that the solution would not be in an immediate, reactionary outburst. It would be an undeniable proof, documented and indisputable. I opened my laptop and began compiling everything: drafts of the presentation with timestamps, emails where I had shared insights and data with no indication of collaboration, annotated spreadsheets showing the evolution of the project from idea to final slides, and saved recordings of meetings where I had first introduced the concepts. Every piece of evidence became a brick in the foundation of my truth. I realized that the power of documentation, combined with the reach of digital platforms, could make it impossible for anyone to claim credit for work that wasn't theirs. Late into the night, I organized folders, labeled screenshots, and prepared a concise but compelling post. It was no longer about revenge, it was about visibility, acknowledgement, and justice. Every sentence, every attachment, every screenshot was carefully considered. When I finally hit publish, a mix of fear, anticipation, and relief washed over me. I knew that once it went online, the story would speak for itself, leaving no room for misrepresentation, no opportunity for my colleague to claim the work I had spent months perfecting. And as I watched the post go live, I understood that the journey toward recognition was only beginning, but this time I would be in control. The morning after I published the post, my inbox and phone erupted in a way that I had never experienced before. Notifications poured in from colleagues, friends, and even distant connections who had somehow come across the post. Some messages were succinct: "I can't believe this happened to you. The work is clearly yours." Others were longer, full of shock, apologies, and disbelief. I remember seeing him present and thinking, "That sounds familiar, didn't you write that? I can't believe I let him take credit like that." The validation was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, the months of silent effort, the late nights, the exhausted weekends, all the labor that had gone unseen, was visible to everyone. For so long, I had felt powerless, trapped in the shadow of someone else's self-promotion. Now, that shadow was dispelled. The evidence I'd compiled, emails, draft versions, annotated spreadsheets, screenshots of previous meetings and timestamps, left no room for denial. The truth was clear, tangible, and irrefutable, and the reactions I was seeing were proof that facts, once laid bare, could not be ignored. By mid-morning, the ripple effect began to spread through the office. Colleagues who had been silent witnesses, or even unintentional enablers, began sending messages privately, acknowledging that they had seen the situation but hadn't acted. Some admitted embarrassment, some admitted guilt. "I always thought he did all the hard work on this," one coworker wrote. "I feel terrible for not noticing sooner," said another. Even those who had interacted closely with my colleague during the presentation were messaging me, confessing that, in hindsight, they realized that the ideas, data, and insights had originated from me. The post had created a sort of social accountability, making it difficult for anyone to ignore the truth without being seen as complicit. Every message, every acknowledgement, was a quiet vindication, a confirmation that my months of dedication had not gone unnoticed. Even if recognition had come late, the most impactful moment came when the post began circulating beyond the immediate office. Former colleagues, industry connections, and even clients who had worked with our team started engaging with it. They commented, shared, and tagged others, extending the visibility of my evidence across professional networks. People I hadn't interacted with in years were sending messages of support. "It's incredible how thorough your documentation is. I've seen so many people take credit for others' work. Thank you for showing that accountability is possible. This is a masterclass in asserting yourself professionally." Even some of my bosses from previous projects reached out, expressing admiration for the way I had handled the situation with calm precision and concrete proof. The post was no longer simply a personal statement. It had become a public lesson in integrity, diligence, and the importance of protecting one's intellectual labor. The attention was both affirming and intimidating. I realized that the narrative had shifted entirely. I had gone from being an invisible contributor to a visible, credible authority, and my colleague, who had once basked in the spotlight, now faced the scrutiny and challenge of explaining his misappropriation. By late afternoon, the consequences for my colleague became unavoidable. Several key people who had attended the presentation reached out privately, questioning him, verifying the sources of the data, and expressing surprise that he had not acknowledged the origins of the work. Some asked to see drafts or emails that would clarify ownership, and he could only respond vaguely, citing memory lapses or miscommunication. The more people examined the evidence, the more apparent it became that the post's documentation was flawless. Even those who had initially supported him hesitated to do so further. It was fascinating to watch the subtle shift in office dynamics. People who had once casually nodded along, accepting his assertions, now looked to me with recognition and respect. In meetings, during casual conversations, and in private exchanges, colleagues began referencing my work accurately, attributing ideas and data to me rather than the person who had tried to claim them. The validation was quiet at first but grew steadily, reinforcing the truth I had fought to reveal and reclaim. By evening, I reflected on the whirlwind of the day. The sense of empowerment was profound, but it was not rooted in triumph over someone else. It came from the recognition that my effort, persistence, and careful preparation had finally been acknowledged, that months of late nights and painstaking research had not been erased. The post had functioned as a bridge, connecting my silent labor with the visibility it deserved, transforming private frustration into public recognition. I felt an unshakable sense of clarity. When truth is documented, shared, and supported by evidence, it cannot remain hidden indefinitely. The colleague who had tried to take credit would have to reckon with that reality, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my narrative, my work, and my professional integrity. As I closed my laptop late that night, exhaustion mingled with relief. The journey toward recognition had only just begun, but for the first time in months, I felt the weight of injustice lifting, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of truth revealed. The days that followed were a mixture of quiet satisfaction and subtle tension. My colleague, once confident and seemingly untouchable, was now walking a tightrope of social and professional accountability. His demeanor changed noticeably. The overconfidence and smugness that had accompanied him into the presentation disappeared, replaced with a cautious, almost defensive air. I noticed it in meetings, in the way he spoke to other team members, and in the careful tone of emails he sent. He no longer made bold claims about the project, nor did he attempt to draw attention to himself. In a sense, the tide had shifted, and the acknowledgement of my contribution became not just a personal victory, but a subtle correction of office dynamics. People who had been unsure of who deserved credit now treated me differently, with a newfound respect for my knowledge and expertise. It was as though the post had rebalanced an invisible scale that had tipped unfairly for months. The online post continued to gain traction within professional circles beyond my office. Industry peers shared it, commented on the importance of documenting work, and discussed it in forums dedicated to corporate ethics, productivity, and professional development. I began receiving messages from people in other companies who had faced similar situations, thanking me for demonstrating how to handle professional misappropriation without resorting to emotional outbursts or confrontation. Some asked for advice on documenting their own contributions, while others simply offered solidarity and encouragement. It became clear that my experience had struck a chord far beyond my immediate surroundings. What had initially felt like a personal injustice had now evolved into a broader conversation about accountability, ethics, and the importance of clearly establishing ownership in collaborative work. The sense of responsibility I felt was immense. I realized that my actions could inspire others to assert their rights professionally, to stand firm in the face of misattribution, and to prioritize integrity over expediency. In the office, the situation grew more complicated as upper management became aware of the post and its implications. The boss, initially unaware of the full context, began reviewing the project materials and emails that I had shared. The documentation was thorough, chronological, and irrefutable. Every draft, every annotated spreadsheet, every email confirming my input built an airtight case. Meetings were scheduled to discuss the project, and suddenly I found myself at the center of conversations where my ideas, data, and analyses were being correctly attributed. My colleague, despite his prior attempts to claim the work, had to navigate these discussions carefully, often referring to my contributions directly or deflecting attention in a way that highlighted the evidence rather than obscuring it. It was a delicate dance of accountability, and I observed it with a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and a touch of vindication. The months of late nights, careful documentation, and quiet patience were finally paying off. But the professional repercussions extended beyond mere acknowledgement. HR became involved after multiple colleagues forwarded links to the post and emails documenting the project's timeline. There was a formal inquiry into the misattribution, and my colleague was called in to provide an explanation. He attempted to minimize his role, but the evidence was clear, compelling, and verifiable. I was asked to present my documentation and recount the timeline of work, which I did calmly and confidently. The process was painstaking and emotionally exhausting, but it reinforced a crucial lesson: meticulous documentation, combined with patience and strategic sharing, could correct injustices even in environments where authority and recognition are often misapplied. By the end of the week, the official recognition of my work had been established. Not only was my contribution formally acknowledged in project records, but the promotion I had long anticipated was back on the table, with management now fully aware of the extent of my input and diligence. On a personal level, the experience reshaped my perception of workplace dynamics. I realized that silence and restraint, while initially prudent, had limitations when confronted with deliberate appropriation. Yet, when paired with careful evidence and deliberate action, they could amplify the impact of one's efforts rather than diminish them. The balance between patience, documentation, and strategic disclosure became clear, and I understood that the narrative of one's labor, be it in gardening, academics, or corporate environments, can only be controlled through consistent, verifiable proof. The colleague who had tried to claim my work now faced a reputation tempered by caution and skepticism, while I had gained something more profound than a promotion: respect, an acknowledgement, and the empowerment that comes from turning injustice into a structured, evidence-backed resolution. The months of frustration, betrayal, and quiet planning had culminated in a demonstration of professionalism, patience, and the undeniable value of owning one's work. The resolution that followed was a mixture of vindication, reflection, and subtle transformation, both for myself and the workplace around me. In the days after the formal acknowledgement, my professional standing shifted dramatically. Colleagues who had once casually overlooked my contributions now sought my insight, guidance, and collaboration. Meetings where my ideas had previously been underappreciated or overshadowed were now forums in which my expertise was actively requested. The boss, once unaware of the depth of my contribution, began assigning me lead responsibilities on follow-up projects and entrusted me with the oversight of presentations, budgets, and data analysis. Even my colleague, now constrained by evidence and accountability, approached discussions with an unusual degree of humility and caution. He made no further attempt to claim credit, and the subtle respect, or perhaps wariness, that now existed between us created a professional equilibrium I had not expected. It was not personal triumph over another, but the restoration of fairness, order, and acknowledgement in a context where previously only misattribution had prevailed. As the recognition settled in, I took a step back to evaluate the journey I had undertaken. Months of late nights, painstaking research, endless rehearsals, and careful documentation had culminated not only in vindication, but in a lesson about the nature of professional environments. The experience clarified a truth that had been painfully overlooked: talent, effort, and intelligence alone do not guarantee acknowledgement. Equally critical is the strategic protection and communication of one's work. By systematically documenting every stage of my project, from initial concepts to final deliverables, I had created a trail that could not be disputed. This strategy became a model not only for myself but for colleagues who had witnessed the ordeal. Some approached me privately, seeking advice on maintaining their own records and ensuring their contributions were visible. In a way, the struggle I endured had evolved into mentorship, a way to guide others in navigating professional spaces where credit is not always automatically given, but must sometimes be asserted with precision and evidence. The online post, which had sparked the initial recognition, continued to resonate beyond the walls of my office. Professional networks, industry contacts, and even friends in other fields commented on the importance of asserting ownership and maintaining meticulous records. Messages from people I had never met conveyed gratitude and admiration. "Your approach is inspiring. This is how we reclaim our work with dignity," wrote one contact. "I've been in a similar situation, and your story gave me courage to act," wrote another. These messages reinforced the realization that my individual struggle was part of a broader narrative. Countless people face misappropriation, dismissal, or oversight, and documentation is a powerful tool for reclaiming agency. My experience, once deeply personal, had transformed into a lesson on ethics, diligence, and strategic self-advocacy. I recognized that by sharing my story, I had contributed to a discourse far larger than a single office conflict. With professional recognition firmly established and the lessons internalized, I allowed myself a sense of closure. The months of stress, frustration, and isolation were replaced by a nuanced satisfaction. I reflected on the emotional journey, the hurt of betrayal, the frustration of invisibility, and the anxiety of confronting a colleague were all tempered by the triumph of truth and the validation of hard work. In the quiet of my apartment, reviewing final project reports and post-publication feedback, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not from revenge, not from undermining anyone else, but from reclaiming agency over my work and demonstrating the enduring value of integrity, patience, and preparation. The promotion, the acknowledgement from colleagues, and the professional credibility were tangible benefits, but the deeper reward was the reaffirmation of my capacity to navigate injustice with dignity and strategy. Ultimately, the experience transformed not just my career but my perspective on professional life. I understood that recognition is not always immediate, that others may attempt to appropriate or minimize one's efforts, and that patience coupled with careful documentation can create irrefutable proof of contribution. The colleague who had tried to take credit faced consequences in terms of reputation and credibility, yet the encounter remained a testament to the efficacy of evidence over confrontation. Meanwhile, I emerged with enhanced respect from peers, a stronger professional network, and the confidence that my work, when protected and presented effectively, would never again be overlooked. As I prepared for my next project, the late nights, meticulous notes, and careful planning felt less like burdens and more like an affirmation of my commitment to excellence. In the end, the journey was more than a struggle for recognition. It was a demonstration that diligence, integrity, and strategy can transform frustration into opportunity, invisibility into acknowledgement, and injustice into a lasting, empowering lesson.